When we pick up the Bible, we think of it as a book that provides good advice for living a safe and secure existence. We think of the Bible as a treasury of wisdom and advice on how we can get along better. We think of the Bible as an outline of the plan of God for the salvation of mankind, because left to his own devices, mankind would otherwise completely destroy themselves, and we would be right. Today, I would like to look at the Bible as a book that has guiding principles regarding justice. How can we fairly determine guilt or innocence? There's a term for the legal procedures by which we obtain justice. We call this due process. For those who would like a title for today's message, we can label it Biblical Justice and Due Process. In a few minutes, we're going to turn to Micah 6:8. But first, I would like us to recall in our early history lessons, in the early 1600s, colonists from England settled in Jamestown, Virginia, and then in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And from 1620 to 1640, in 20 years, over about 20,000 separatists and Puritans left England and came to Massachusetts. And they built a strong religious community, and they purged everyone who didn't really want to worship like they did. And that religious migration provides a background for what was going to happen some 50 to 70 years later. According to History.com, the infamous Salem witch trials began during the spring of 1692 after a group of young girls in Salem Village, Massachusetts, claimed to be possessed of the devil and accused several local women of witchcraft. As a wave of hysteria spread throughout colonial Massachusetts, a special court convened in Salem to hear the cases. The first convicted witch, Bridget Bishop, was hanged at that time. 18 others followed Bishop to Salem's Gallows Hill, while some 150 more men, women, and children were accused over the next several months. It carries on under the Salem witch trials, and Wikipedia says more than 200 people were accused, 19 of whom were found guilty and executed by hanging, 14 women and 5 men. One other man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death for refusing to plead, and at least 5 people died in jail. It was the deadliest witch hunt in the history of the United States. Now, when they say the fellow was pressed to death, he was placed between 2 platforms, and then they put heavy weights like rocks on him until he was pressed to death. Well, there have been other witch hunts, as we can call them, throughout the ages, and even up into recent times, in which an accuser would point a finger at someone, and the heinous accusation would destroy that person's life. The Salem witch hunt episode in history demonstrates the power of false accusations. And now I'd like to take a look at the other side. Because the power of a false accusation, let's take a look at accusations where people were seeking justice. 60 years after the Salem witch trials ended, the French and Indian War took place in North America. It started in 1754 and ended in 1763. This French and Indian War was actually part of a world war that was between Great Britain and France. And in Europe, the war was called something else. It was called the 7 Years' War. Now, if you're taking highly detailed notes, you notice from 1754 to 1763 is actually 9 years. Yet it was still called in the history books the 7 Years' War. None of us have figured out why yet. Well, this American location of the war was fought in Canada and what is now Ohio, in that area. And it's called the French and Indian War. The French and their allies, the Indians, fought against the British and their allies, other Indians. And the two sides were fighting for control of Canada and the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, including Ohio. Basically, Great Britain was fighting France yet again. As a high school teacher, from time to time, I ask students to recall how often Great Britain and France got into a war, and they usually all answer together every Monday. The Brits and the British were constantly, the Brits and the French were constantly fighting. But it wasn't just that the British and the French were fighting. The American Indian tribes were also continually at war with each other, each carving out and defending their own territories. Well, the French and Indian War, let's go back to 1754. The American colonists were dragged into this war, and a war that had its roots in Europe. The aftermath of this war would change the world. Great Britain won the war. The French soldiers had to leave Canada, which is why French Quebec is owned by the British today through English Canada. But the British soldiers didn't go back to Europe. 10,000 British troops were in place in the 13 American colonies along the eastern coast. The British troops had to be fed, clothed, and housed. This cost a lot of money. A lot of money. And since Great Britain had put the war on a credit card, they had to pay the bill. And so the Americans' colonists' taxes went way up. To cut the cost of housing British soldiers, the English Parliament authorized what's called the Quartering Act, a law compelling American colonists to let British soldiers live in their homes. And you can imagine how well that went over with the American colonists, strangers living in their houses. Or as I tell my 14 and 15-year-old students, can you imagine a 25 to 35-year-old soldier of war living in the house with you? Well, there were problems with this. Living in cramped quarters, the British soldiers got on the nerves of the American colonists. From time to time, some British soldiers would commit rapes, robberies, or murders. The British Army authorized trials to condemn these, to hold the trial to determine the guilt or innocence of the offending soldier. But the accused British soldier was put on a ship and sent back to England for a trial. No American witnesses or other evidence would be presented at the trial in England because it was 3,000 miles away. And without any proof of guilt or evidence, the British soldier would then be set free and reassigned to some other unit. We can imagine the sense of fury, of anger, and injustice by the victims and the families of those who had been raped, robbed, or murdered. It was only a few years later that the Americans declared independence and fought the Revolutionary War. The Declaration of Independence stated as one of the reasons for separating from Great Britain was the lack of due process, the failure of the British government to abide by basic human dignities, including the upholding of the law to protect both the accused and the accuser. Well, we have these two examples in the United States history to demonstrate the power of false accusations, the Salem witch trials, and the injustice of not believing the accuser, which resulted in guilty soldiers not being held accountable for their crime. In both cases, justice was not served. Well, let's look then, turn to Micah 6:8, and let's look to biblical principles of justice and the steps that lead to justice, these steps that we call due process. In Micah 6:8, and today I'll be quoting from the New King James Version unless otherwise mentioned. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly. I'm going to stop right there. That's the first thing listed, to do justly. If we look in Strong's H4941, this justly means to render properly a verdict, either favorable or unfavorable, especially a sentence or a formal decree based upon the participants' either divine law or collective law. And it goes on to explain this justly really means a fair decision that's reasonable to the facts from all sides. So let's ask a question then. What does it mean to do justly? So we're going to inquire of that today, and we have three major points. So first of all, to do justly, there must be a claim of injury or damages. First of all, there must be a claim of injury or damages, a formal expression that there was a problem. From time to time, people complain about something. Perhaps it was a faulty product that they purchased. Perhaps the product didn't work as advertised. Perhaps someone received poor service when they had their car repaired or their house remodeled. Some people just like to complain to others, but they don't seek to have the problem resolved. And some people go even so far as to file a lawsuit against someone else, then they claim damages. When the complainer gets to court, it is standard operating for the judge to inquire. Did you make the claim with the other party and seek to resolve the problem before you came to court? If the petitioner did not seek to resolve the problem before going to court, the judge will, as a matter of course, dismiss the case, dismiss the lawsuit. We have a principle that you must seek to resolve the problem ahead of time. In fact, it's a biblical admonition. If we look at Matthew 18, I'm only going to pull out one verse, Matthew 18, verse 15. But how do we handle that amongst members in the church? In Matthew 18:15, moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you've gained a brother. So there's a principle of going to try to resolve the problem. We have that same in Matthew 5:24. We have a similar admonition that if we're going to worship God, we're going to bring our gift to the altar, in this case our worship. In Matthew 5:24, we're instructed to leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. So you try to resolve the problems first. That's a biblical principle. So we can do it privately if at all possible. Now, it's up to individuals to put forth the effort to make the claim or attempt to resolve issues. Now, I recognize that sometimes it's difficult or even impossible to make peace with some people. In Romans 12, we're instructed, in Romans 12:18, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Notice the caveat or the comment there, if it's possible. The implication here is that with some people, it's just not possible because they are seemingly impossible. And I suspect we all know someone who is difficult, if not impossible, to deal with. So the first thought here is that there must be a claim of injury or damage. So if there's going to be an accusation, there has to be a claim. You have to state the claim. The second point today is the claim must be supported with evidence. Otherwise, it's just talk. It's just a claim. In Western jurisprudence, which is the fancy word for modern legal practices, a lawsuit must have at its core at least a scintilla of evidence. At least a tiny piece of evidence. You must have something. A simple claim of injury is not enough. There must be some supporting evidence to back up that claim. The Bible puts evidence in terms of witnesses. So if we turn to Deuteronomy 19, in Deuteronomy 19, this evidence that's claimed, it speaks about evidence in terms of witnesses here. In Deuteronomy 19, in verse 15, one witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established. The claim of injury or damage must be supported or corroborated by at least 2 witnesses. Otherwise, an accusation simply becomes the he said, or he said, she said. And we've all heard what somebody has said. In Proverbs 18:17, I've learned to be very careful, as you probably have as well. When somebody says something, we are to be very careful to believe everything at face value. In Proverbs 18:17, the first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him. Another translation says, any story sounds true until you search out the truth. In Acts 17, we have the Berean example of searching out the truth in 17:11. This is after Paul was thrust out of Thessalonica in Acts 17:11, and he went to Berea. These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica in that they received the word with all readiness. They were hungry. They were eager for the truth. And what does it continue to say? And they searched the scriptures daily. It doesn't stop there. There's no period at the end of that. And they searched, it says, to find out whether these things were so. They were looking for evidence. The Apostle Paul made a claim. And he was preaching the gospel, and they were looking in the Word of God. Where is the evidence? What do we have here? And that's an expectation for us. This is here for our admonition, for our learning. the seeking of evidence. Back in Matthew 18, we read Matthew 18:15, but if we carry on then in Matthew 18, verse 16, but he, meaning if the person talked to, will not here take with you one or two more, meaning witnesses, that by the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. So that would provide some evidence where there may not have been earlier. So we have this principle of corroboration, where there must be proof, and not just a little bit of proof, but a substantial amount of proof is demonstrated by two or three witnesses. Well, now you might ask, well, what about false witnesses? Many years ago, I had a law professor who came to class every day, and he wrote on the chalkboard. Had a piece of chalk, he picked it up, and he would turn his back to the class, and he would write on the board these simple words: trial equals lying contest. Now, he never said anything about the words that he put on the chalkboard, the trial equals lying contest. He simply and quietly, the words were displayed behind him as he proceeded to give his lecture. What do you suppose we all learned after a semester of watching him come in every day? Trial equals lying contest. Of course, the lesson there is how do you discern the truth? You're sorting out from the evidence, without him ever having to say it, you have to sort out the evidence to see where the truth exists. So what is this about then false witnesses? We know that God hates false witnesses. It's in Exodus 20, verse 16, we know that it's foundational and appears in the Ten Commandments. In Exodus 20:16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not is a pretty strong term. On one of my teacher textbooks, I have a post-it note. Thou shalt not touch. And students are inclined to reach for that nearby book, and they see the thou shalt not on it. And they immediately know it's a very serious matter. And one student says, does anybody even use that old English term anymore? And I just held up the book. Case closed. Thou shalt not. Well, this is listed here. What we should not do is bear false witness against a neighbor. But that isn't the only statement in the Bible that tells us to avoid being a false witness or bearing false witness. Because you don't have to say false witness. You can bear it in some other nonverbal way. In Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, there's a list of 7 things that God hates. In Proverbs 6, 16 through 19, these 6 things the Lord hates, yes, 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift in running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among the brethren. The 7 things that God hates have false witness as a common foundation. In Exodus 23, verses 1 and 2, we're instructed, you shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. This is interesting because when you're teaching a subject like government and the terms democracy comes up and republic comes up, and most students don't know the definition of those 2 terms, and so I explain it this way. A democracy is 2 foxes and a chicken voting on what to have for supper. The majority rules, whereas in a republic, you have to live by the rule of law, in which case the minority's rights are protected. In both cases, there's a decision-making process going on. Then the light starts to come up. Maybe we don't have democracy because we have the rights. Biblical rights are protected in the Bible, the rights of due process, just as they are in American law under the Constitution. Well, what's the penalty for being a false witness? Oh, let me back up here to Psalm 35 and verse 20. talking about false witnesses. For they do not speak peace. What's peace? Lack of conflict? But they devise deceitful matters against the quiet ones in the land. Who do you hear rising up making lots of noise? It's often the deceitful ones. The false witnesses are rising up. The people that are going about their normal business aren't the ones standing up saying, I run Honest John's car sales. If he was honest, he wouldn't have to say it, okay? So you have the quiet ones are the ones that assume that other people are telling or should be telling the truth. So what's then the penalty for being a false witness? Let's continue on in Deuteronomy 19, starting in verse 16. The penalty for a false witness, Deuteronomy 19:16. If a false witness rises against any man to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both men in the controversy shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who serve in those days, and the judges shall make careful inquiry. And indeed, if the witness is a false witness, who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother, and you shall put away the evil from among you. That's a pretty severe penalty, that the false witness would then deserve and receive the punishment of what they intended to inflict on their target. There was a judge that once said, it's not the fear of hanging that deters crime, but the certainty of it. Well, if people knew with a certainty that they would suffer the consequences that they intended for others, they would probably be less likely to provide false testimony. We know that because as readers of the Bible, we know that there is a destiny for those who are liars that deliver false witness in Revelation 21, verses 7 through 9. And in Revelation 21:7, it's talking about people, Christians, who are overcomers, overcoming evil things. And in verse 7, he who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. And now we get into verse 8. But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So ultimately, unrepentant sins will lead to perishing. And it puts the lying part in the same category as all of these other things that we find very difficult. Now, there's another verse, and I didn't write it down, but I do believe it was either Peter or Paul that said, as such were some of you. In other words, the people in the church represent all parts of society that have the capacity to turn. This is what the word is repent is about, turn, go another way. And that's why he said, as such were some of you. And repentance, of course, is a daily, weekly, monthly, and annual process. Back in Deuteronomy 19, we read that the false witness was to receive the punishment that he intended for the target of his witness. And then it says something really dramatic. And people twitch on this and they misunderstand it. When it says in Deuteronomy 19, verse 20, and those who remain shall hear and fear, meaning the witnesses that saw the punishment of the false witness, and hereafter they shall not again commit such evil among you. That goes back to the certainty of punishment. Well, if you see somebody having a consequence, you're not so likely to do that. And then again, I recall in first grade at country school, and my brother was in second grade, and he came home and told Mommy and Daddy the new words he learned in school that day. And there was my dad with the arm around the head and a bar of soap making the rounds in my brother's mouth. I witnessed this event, and I concluded that this would be a good thing not for me to do, because I witnessed the immediate consequence of that action. But now we read on in verse 21, your eyes shall not pity, life shall be for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and hand for hand, foot for foot. And many take that in a sense that they look at the surface of it and do not look at the underlying principle. A more complete understanding of the verse should include an understanding of that underlying principle. If the false accuser desired the punishment of the innocent person to be quite expensive or severe, the false accuser must suffer the same cost or expense. In other words, the financial burden to make up for the diminished earning capacity of someone who would have lost an eye, a hand, a foot, or even a life. Basically, one view of this verse is that if the false accuser intended the death penalty for the innocent, the false accuser may not just forfeit his life or perhaps his life earnings, whatever is in the eyes of the judge. There are other examples of types of witnesses that the Bible gives understanding to about justice, because you can't base a decision on the lack of law, because you need a law as a guide. Otherwise, what are you judging against? How we feel today? What do? Do you tell somebody, do I tell students, well, how are you going to evaluate this paper? Well, it depends on what I had for breakfast. Well, it depends on whether I woke up 2:30 in the morning giggling as to how much I wanted to punish the students. No, you don't do that. You do it fairly, you do it consistently. And that means there has to be a standard. Now, God gave us the 10 Commandments. He also gave us principles throughout the Bible. One of those principles in Deuteronomy 19, you notice we're spending some time there in Deuteronomy 19 today. In verse 14, you shall not remove your neighbor's landmark, which the men of old have set in your inheritance, which you will inherit in the land that the Lord your God is going to give you to possess. Now, not moving the landmarks is repeated in Job 24:2 and Proverbs 22:28. Why is that so important, moving the landmarks? Moving the goalposts, as it were. If you're on a football team and you decide, you know what, that's really a long way to get to the other end of the field, so you have your buddies go pick up the goalposts and move them a little closer. That's moving a landmark, as it were. Had a neighbor on the farm where I grew up, and there was no fence line between the two. The neighbors would each farm up to the common boundary, but one neighbor would always plow one furrow over onto his neighbor, and the neighbor knew that's what he was like, so he would plow one furrow back, had a stake on each end of the field, and he would do it. And so sometimes it's good to have a firm boundary. Well, here was the boundary of the rocks, of the landmark. Now, it could be a tree, it could be rocks. I knew when I grew up, we picked a lot of rocks. And where did we put them? We didn't stick them in the middle of the field. We put them on the edge of the field where there was a boundary, and those rocks tended to mark the boundary. And oftentimes what would happen then is a tree, seedlings would grow up in or by the rock pile, and then after a number of years, my great-grandfather's rock pile and my grandfather's rock piles would be having a tree growing out of them, and it became a landmark that you could see for a long distance. In Genesis 31, verse 43, in Genesis 31, there was a story of Jacob and his father-in-law Laban, and Jacob was leaving his father-in-law and took Laban's daughters and was going back to the land of Canaan. And Laban was chasing his son-in-law and daughters and grandchildren, and they came to an agreement. In Genesis 31, starting in verse 43, and Laban answered and said to Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children, meaning grandchildren, are my children, and this flock is my flock. All you see is mine. Laban was concerned. In other words, everything came forth from me. You came in with nothing, and now you have all of this. It should really kind of belong to me. But what can I do this day to these my daughters or their children whom they have borne? Now, therefore, verse 44, come, let us make a covenant, you and I. Let it be a witness between you and me. Notice, there was a witness, not a personal witness, but a thing. In verse 45, and we read about this witness, this thing, in verse 45, so Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. Then Jacob said to his brethren, gather stones. And they took stones and they made a heap. And they ate there on the heap, and Laban called it, this name that's difficult to pronounce. And Jacob called it another name difficult to pronounce. And Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me this day. Therefore, its name was called Galeed, also Mizpah, because he said, may the Lord watch between you and me when we are absent one from another. And Laban says, if you afflict my daughters, or if you take other wives besides my daughters, although no man is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. So there's a symbol, the rocks, and then rocks, and he's calling on God to be the witness for them. In other words, his conscience would be stricken. Verse 51, and Laban said to Jacob, here is this heap, here is this pillar which I have placed between you and me. This heap is a witness. This pillar is a witness, and I will not pass beyond this heap to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to me for harm. What was Laban concerned about? That Jacob would come back and claim Laban's estate. After all, he had already grown rich, and so he said, no, I want this to be a barrier. We have this understanding, this barrier there. And so we have this concept of claim. On point 2, a claim must be supported by evidence, whether it's a human witness or other evidence that's a witness to the issue. The third point today is an impartial inquiry must be made. An impartial inquiry must be made. An inquiry that's not impartial is no inquiry at all. Rather than a false inquiry is a mockery of justice. The British soldier accused of rape or robbery or murder, who was sent to England for trial, made a mockery of the judicial system. No evidence or witnesses would be available at trial in England for the crime committed in America. Back to Deuteronomy 19 and verse 18, we already read in verse 8, and the judges shall make careful inquiry. So there has to be an inquiry. What's going on? Let's seek out the truth. Often quoted is Proverbs 18, verse 17. You know, every once in a while you'll hear some wild tidbit come in from somebody, and it's really juicy. Whoa, I didn't know that. Wow. And then you might think ill of somebody. What does Proverbs 18:17 say? The first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him. There has to be an inquiry, some kind of inquiry to seek out the truth. We're in Proverbs. Let's go to 11, verse 9. The English Standard Version of Proverbs 11:9, with his mouth the godless man would destroy his neighbor, but by knowledge the righteous are delivered. So we have this willingness by somebody who is not following God's law, doesn't have a conscience in that regard. The godless man was quite willing to destroy his neighbor with a false witness. But interestingly, it says that, but by knowledge the righteous are delivered. How can that happen? There needs to be an impartial inquiry, a reasonable impartial inquiry to bring out the truth. The New King James says it this way: the hypocrite with his mouth destroys his neighbor, but through knowledge the righteous will be delivered. In the American legal system, there are 4 steps to inquiry or due process when a lawsuit is being initiated. You might call this process a way to obtain multiple witnesses to resolve a matter. The legal system calls this the discovery process. There's really 4 steps to this discovery process. Is when a lawsuit is initiated, the claiming party who claims the damage or offense sends out a letter and requests and has what's called request for admissions. It says, can we all agree on these basic facts? What's the name of the person? Maybe their birth date, their address, some basic information, where they live, that they have relationships to other people that are involved in the case, and so forth. Just basic information, request for admissions. And usually one party and then the other party can respond. I will admit these basic things: name, birth date, address, and so forth. But sometimes the party requesting admissions will slip in a list of other things. And you admit that you're guilty beyond all belief. You admit that you've been bad since birth and got worse, and so forth. And they slip all these things in there. And if you don't respond, You know what the standard due process is? If you don't respond, you are admitting, these are under the request for admissions, you're admitting those things are true. So you'd best read the fine print on the request for admissions and only agree to things that are actual facts. The second step are interrogatories. It's a big word for questions. Each side can issue a list of up to 60 questions to the other side, and the other side must answer those questions within a certain time frame under penalty of perjury. Perjury means lying to the court, which can cost up to 5 years in prison for each perjury penalty. If you're a lawyer and you commit perjury, you can lose your law license, be stripped of your practice before the Supreme Court and the state court. That's only happened to one ex-president at this point. But interrogatories, and these questions can be very challenging. 60 questions. Can you imagine the kind of questions they can ask? Pretty much anything that relates to the case. How many toothbrushes have you used in the last 3 years? What's the brand of toothpaste? How many fence posts on your property? Things that will really keep you running. That it could be little, it could be inane, silly questions that if they somehow relate to the issue, you're obligated to answer it. And you can, or very difficult questions. Please list all banks you have ever done business with in the last X number of years, the bank account numbers, the addresses, and so forth. And that's routinely asked in interrogatories because if they win the lawsuit, they want to collect your money. So you have these interrogatories that can ask challenging, and you must sign the interrogatories under penalty of perjury when you answer. Both sides have to do that. Step 3 in the legal process, request for production of documents. Each side can request the other side to provide documents that can be helpful to resolve the case. Please bring a copy of the car title to demonstrate who the state thinks owns the car, or some other document. Please bring a copy of your driver's license or your Social Security card. Please bring a copy of the contract that you claim was between us. Please bring, and you have a list of things that request for production of documents. And then step 4, after all of those are done, then the step 4 is depositions. This is where one side can ask questions of the other. They each bring their lawyer and they sit across the table. There is a court reporter there writing every word down. Every cough, sneeze, and comma is going to be in there. And each side will ask questions of the other side. So they can depose or ask the other side. What's the purpose of all this? Because if there's still an issue when all of this is done, then when the issue goes to trial, then there is a basis. These are all things that are witnesses that can be used at the trial. And so what if one side says, I'm not going to do it, not going to participate? Guess what happens when it goes to trial or to the court? The court will sanction or penalize the party that refused to cooperate. It won't go well with them in the trial. So it's interesting to note that by the time the entire discovery process is complete, a trial is said to be 95% process and only 5% related to the facts. I remember the first time I heard that. I was shocked. I thought everything hung on the facts. My uncle, an attorney, was giving some advice. He said, when you're at the table, you pound. If you're strong on the facts, you pound on the facts. If your case is strong on the law, you pound on the law. He said, if you don't have the facts or the law, you pound on the table. Well, 95% of it tends to be process. And so we're talking due process today. If people follow due process of law, the truth is more likely to become evident. And if the process is flawed, as we read about in the witch trials or the soldiers sent back to England, then the facts won't be revealed if you have a flawed process, and justice will not be served. In Genesis 39, we have an interesting story of a biblical example of the perversion of justice through the denial of due process of law. And there's a blatant and outrageous example that we read about Joseph, who was taken to Egypt in Genesis 39, and I'll paraphrase this case. Jacob, it starts out, had been taken to Egypt, and he went and was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. And Jacob was a diligent fellow. We read in verse 6, he was a handsome in form and appearance. And the boss's wife, Potiphar, tried to get him to commit adultery with her. And he did the right thing. He fled. He left because he said, how can I do this, sin against God and to my master? And so he left. But unfortunately, if we look in verse 12, she caught him by the garment, and she held on to that garment, and he left it behind when he fled. And that garment became a piece of evidence. It was a witness against him. Well, if he wasn't trying to do that, why did she have his garment that he would have never willingly given over, as it were? Verse 16, she kept his garment with her until his master came home. And what happened to Joseph is he was thrown into prison for years. So that's a really traumatic example of an injustice. There wasn't a reasonable inquiry into due process. How did this come to be? It was a rather quick decision. Now, it served a greater purpose because, as we know, all things work together for good to those that love God. And we know that Joseph loved God because he said in his own mind, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So we have that example that Joseph was thrown into prison based on false testimony. In the next case, we know of the matter of King Ahab, Queen Jezebel, and Naboth. And this story comes out in 1 Kings 21. And this is really a sad story. But King Ahab wanted the vineyard that was next to his. He could look out over the palace and he could see it. It looked good. The guy was taking good care of it, Naboth. But he couldn't figure, the guy wouldn't sell it to him. Naboth wouldn't sell it. So Ahab, he was bummed. He just was not going to get what he coveted so much. And Jezebel basically said, leave it to me. And now in 1 Kings 21, in verses 8 through 16, she says, she left to her. Here's what she did. She wrote letters in the king's name. Oh, she wrote the letters and used the king's seal. Well, there's false witness right there. And sent the letters to elders and nobles who were dwelling in the city with Naboth, and proclaim a fast and high honors. Really promote this guy, build him up. And you've probably heard the term: the higher they rise, the harder they fall. So she was building him up for the big crash, and then she told the scoundrels that she sent letters to bear witness against Naboth, saying he has blasphemed God and the king, and then take him out and stone him that he may die. And you know what? It worked just that way. They built up Naboth, if we read in those verses, and the people were all cheering at one time, and then they were aghast. They were shocked at the terrible things that they heard about this guy. Here was a fellow who was falsely accused, but you had these false witnesses. Well, you got your witnesses right there. And so he was taken out and stoned. It gives the indication there wasn't much time lost. It happened rather quickly here. And so you have this in the matter of Naboth. As an upright man, people were ready to believe good things about him. He had to have lived a good life for that. He was built up in the public eye, and then immediately after they had willingly honored him, they believed the false reports against him, and he had a horrible death of stoning. There's no record of a formal or impartial inquiry to determine the facts in the case. There's no record of due diligence to find out the truth, just the testimony of a couple of liars who appear to have been paid to falsely condemn Naboth. But Naboth wasn't the only one. In Mark 14, we read about another one who was falsely accused. In Mark 14, we read of the condemnation of Jesus Christ by the Sanhedrin. In Mark 14, starting in verse 53, and they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and elders and the scribes. But Peter followed him at a distance, so he was watching to see what would go on. And verse 55, now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death. Now it's interesting, they found none. What had happened just a few days before is that Christ had come in triumphant entry to Jerusalem. He had a 3.5-year ministry healing many people. He had a good name. And so people weren't readily willing to come up with lots of testimony against Christ. So they had, verse 56, many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies didn't agree. Ouch. And that's what a trial does, is it ferrets out the truth. In many cases, we have now an inquiry, but the testimonies did not agree. And if the testimony doesn't agree, it's called impeaching the testimony, and it cannot be believed. Verse 57, some rose and bore false witness against him, meaning Christ, saying, we've heard him say, and then that I will destroy the temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But even then, their testimony did not agree. So you have this Christ being accused, constantly accused, okay, and false witnesses were raised up against him. In verse 63, they all condemned him to be deserving of death. So throughout history, people have suffered indignities, torture, even death because of false accusers, and because of the lack of the due process of law. A failure to seek out the truth of a matter can yield bad results. If people took upon them the responsibility to seek the truth, they would become, as the Bereans, seeking to whether these things be so. As to those who are called to join God's family, we have an obligation to follow God's instructions, which we also call God's laws. We read in Micah 6:8 that we are required to do justly, and of course the verse does not stop there. It continues on with love mercy and walk humbly with your God. So a summary of point 3, an impartial inquiry must be made. You see, justice without due process isn't justice at all. It's only when justice is combined with mercy and humility that true justice can be obtained. The Salem witch trials of the 1690s were an example of the lack of due process in the quest for justice. The intolerable situation between the British overlords and the American colonists after the French and Indian War in the late 1700s was so intense that a new country was born. And in this new country, the United States of America put into place in its government documents and principles to assure that American citizens could be assured of the due process of law. We read the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, called the Bill of Rights. In this list, there are 35 detailed items that spell out just what due process looks like for residents of the United States. The founders were fearful that if due process of the law were not made an integral part of the American governance, then a tyranny would be developed. But despite due process being the law of the land, injuries still occur. In her book Out of Control, author Brenda Scott notes the research that 65% of claims of child abuse or neglect are patently false. Shockingly and uncomfortably, 35% are true. Thankfully, we have a system of justice that we hope is designed to weed out false accusations. And we have things now with the modern advent of DNA and so forth. But even greater, we have a guidebook. We have an understanding of what a God expects of us, is to do justly. And in order to do that, we have to follow what God calls due process. And there's an orderly process, and we can look to the Bible for those kinds of steps in due process. There must be a claim of injury, a formal expression that there's a problem. The claim must be supported by evidence. An impartial inquiry must be made, because the Bible contains that basis for the due process of law. And if we all followed these steps in Micah 6:8, we would then know what is required of us, but to do justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with our God.